I'm Vicki Hogarth and welcome to Southwest Magazine. Today's guest, Margaret Leahey Bailey, made history not only as the first female TV reporter in New Brunswick, but also for her groundbreaking investigative work. I spoke with her about her unique career as well as what she thinks about journalism today. So from one New Brunswick newsgirl to another, thank you for being here, Margaret.
It's a real privilege and a pleasure.
You broke history in this province being the first TV reporter who was female in New Brunswick. Can you talk about your career and where it started and how you got into it in a time when there weren't that many women in your field?
Well, I didn't actually plan journalism. I thought I'd either be a teacher or a lawyer. And journalism sort of happened to me. And I'm so grateful it did, because it allowed me to cover so many important issues, important to New Brunswickers. And so I started in newspaper, and I did everything in newspaper, reporting, column, and I was very close to the people as well in my reporting. I was totally surprised one day when I was asked to join television, go into broadcasting. And how that happened was that I was getting a lot of letters from people in northern New Brunswick not happy with their television programming. And so I would write about that, and I felt I should go see the station manager. And in those days, the tape recorders were huge, you know. And the first thing he said to me was, "Shut that damn thing off." And I didn't. And he said 3 days later, when he asked me to come work with him, he admired my spunk. So that took me into television. It was quite interesting, the kind of opportunity and attitude towards the media back then compared to today.
What did you think was different back then?
Well, I think because there wasn't the 24-hour news networks, which tend to allow more opinion than news. There was a real focus on news, and people knew their newsmakers and they knew their reporters. And the people that came into their living rooms every night, they got to know and trust, and that was important. And credibility, because if you didn't have credibility, people wouldn't listen to you. And so when I went into TV news and became the first female TV news reporter in New Brunswick, I knew that people were watching me, maybe waiting for me to make a mistake because it was live TV, or what I was wearing, right? Or how my hair was. Those
Especially when you're a woman, that becomes part of the package.
But then I knew when they were actually listening to me. And that was so important to me because I felt that.
But back then I feel like people would have actually depended on the local news more, understood the value of it, which maybe is lost today a little bit and possibly coming back.
Well, I hope it's coming back, and that's why CHCO is so important, because it's local program, it's community programming, and that is so valuable because we've lost that. And people, they've lost their faith in the media. And you see what happens when you see reporters challenging the President of the United States, and you know, that should never happen. And if it ever happened in this province, you'd be fired, right? And so it's not good for the media, it's not good for the people. And people don't want to get all stressed when they're watching the news, and they want the facts. They just want the facts. And we have to trust people enough to let them have the facts. They can form their own opinions. They can form their own opinions. And that's how I always covered the news. And that's why I never had a problem getting a story or breaking stories.
I feel like investigative reporting is underfunded today, undervalued.
Definitely.
But there was a part of your career that was really groundbreaking for you in a lot of ways. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think investigative reporting is very critical in today's society and in our province even, and our country, because we need to know what's really going on. But sadly, the stations in private television, they're not putting the money into investigative reporting. So really it's only the CBC that has the means to be able to do it. But back in the 70s, I exposed the corruption in the Hatfield government, the kickback scandal. And back then that was tremendously important. And
can you explain what it was for people who might not know?
What it meant was if you had a contract with the government, you would have to pay a percentage of that to the PC party bagman every month. And the RCMP were investigating because they felt that this broke the law. Their criminal charges warranted. But Hatfield said he wasn't going to have any charges late, and he told that to his Justice Minister, John Baxter. And so there was then a problem of government interference in RCMP investigations. And the RCMP were just trying to do their job. And of course, I was breaking these stories, and my station manager was on the executive of the PC Association. So that made it very challenging. I had to have really foolproof sources, right? Which I always did anyway. And so Hatfield called the station manager up, and he says, "What are you more interested in, investigative reporting or getting liquor advertising?" You see, back then, the stations weren't allowed to advertise beer or liquor or wine, and they wanted that revenue. So it was, you know, after my stories, and I won awards for excellence in broadcasting for that, but there was a lot of personal impacts to that. My roommate, they tried to find out my sources through her. They said, "Well, you live with Margaret Leahey, who, you know, who's she talking to?" My father was a salesman. He sold tools to the contractors who were paying kickbacks. They were saying, "Tell your daughter to knock off." And then one time when I was coming down Route 8, this black sedan came out of nowhere, and I didn't have any windshield washer left in my car, and it was an MLA, and he was trying to push me off the road.
Especially in today's day and age, where we're seeing reporters have their lives threatened or even taken because of the things they're covering. What did you take away from that experience, being threatened? And what do you think should be done for journalists now to make sure that they're able to do their stories and stay safe at the same time?
Well, I also wrote a book about that, and I did a whole chapter on Dora Robinson Hatfield. That was Richard Hatfield's mother, and she said she knew her son had lied. You know, so writing that book was good for me, but also I felt I was there to do that job, to expose that, and they brought in new party financing legislation as a result of that. So I don't think reporters should ever be afraid to do what's right and to be true to themselves and to whoever they're interviewing.
Do you think the general public lacks knowledge of how often maybe that happens in Canada? How often maybe the news is silenced because of stuff behind?
Well, even I've never talked publicly about this before. I'm sharing all this with you for the first time today. It's not something that you talk about, you know, it's in your career, and it's an accomplishment because you weren't frightened away. And I love New Brunswick. That's why we're back here, right? Because my career took me out to Edmonton and Calgary, where I met my husband, which was tremendous, and it was in a crisis situation, so good things can come out of a crisis, with a pipeline exploding in Edmonton, and I was covering it. So, and we've been together 40 years, so that's wonderful. So I feel like I've been very successful, but I'm also very grateful for that, and that's why my home province means so much to me, and I love to do anything I can to enhance New Brunswick and help people communicate better here.
Do you think this is a province that's lacking in a lot of coverage? We feel as a local station that we're covering a lot of things that we don't see any other reporters at, and it's always shocking. We're a community station and we're the only ones there.
Well, the media has changed dramatically in New Brunswick. CHSJ in St. John used to be a huge station. Now there's 1 or 2 people there, you know, working for Global, and then ATV has a couple of people. But, you know, you need healthy media for a good democracy, you really do. And the people that run government have to realize that having good relationships with the media is very positive. It's very beneficial for you, right? Because if you're in government and you bring a policy forward, if you don't explain it properly to the people when you first announce it, you're going to be behind the 8 ball all the way through. And then some governments refuse to back down, which to me is not good, because if you don't have the public behind you, you're having problems.
Can we talk about what happened to you, though, after your groundbreaking reporting? Where did your career go? Were there ramifications to exposing?
No, not career-wise. Everything just kept going up. And I went to CBC in Charlottetown, and I did the daily public affairs show Compass, and that's where I wrote my book, living in this beautiful house just outside Charlottetown in Alexandra. And it was called Dirt in the Sandbox, because sandbox politics It was provincial politics. And then from there I went to Edmonton. And I worked at a great station, very reflective of the West, young, aggressive, and very positive. And I did news there, political news, for 9 years, as well as a federal provincial current affairs show. And then from television, I went into government. I was appointed to head up a government commission in Alberta, which I did. And that was very, very busy. And I reported to the legislature. And from there, I went and worked at the highest levels of government in Canada with one of the most dynamic, dedicated politicians and honorable politicians I've ever met in all my life. And I've worked and interviewed presidents and prime ministers from all over the world, right, in my career. But Don Mazankowski, it was tremendous. He was known as the Minister of Everything, and he was Deputy Prime Minister.
As a reporter, what was it that told you I have to tell this story? What was it that gave you the inspiration to follow something and see what was happening, whether you expose it or just get to the bottom of what's going on?
Well, I think you knew. And I was raised to know the difference between right and wrong. And so I can remember when I first went to Fredericton, I really did think most politicians were honest. You know, so I had a sharp learning curve. I really, really did. And our press gallery was phenomenal, wonderful people, you know. And I know you've seen the picture of me with all the men, but they were great people, and I stay in touch with many of them today who are still alive, some of them. But our press room was just opposite the government members' room, and so Hatfield would come in and take a story out of the typewriter. If he didn't like it, you know, go in the garbage. I mean, it was quite a different press era then.
Do you think there's maybe a crisis in Canadian media in the sense that we're looking at a time in the digital age where we've got Rogers, Shaw and Bell as media moguls that are vertically integrated, that own your phone plan and your internet, and they're controlling a lot of the information in more ways than I think we saw possible before the internet changed the field? Is that maybe dangerous in the sense that what's being in the news and what's not in the news is controlled by just a handful of private enterprises that might have their own political ideas?
Well, I look at it from a different way. I'm more concerned about the impact of social media and the erroneous information that can get out. And in a crisis situation or when something is happening, it's very important that that be checked and that be corrected if it is not right, because we're living in a different age there with the social media, because certain information can be put on there or not put on there, and people need it. It's a part of our lives that never used to be here.
And it's still changing. I don't think anyone really has the answer.
And you know what also is interesting is that today everybody's a reporter.
Yes.
They have their cell phones. A police officer goes to a scene of an accident. Everybody's got their cell phones out recording, right? And so if there's a crisis situation, that they can be on the air before first responders even get there.
Which has positives to it.
Yes, but it's amazing. Think about that for a second, okay? It's on the air. People are watching it on TV before the first responders.
Twitter's hashtags blow up before the news is even there.
On the scene. So that takes skill and real creative communication. See how communication is the key to everything. Everything. Bad communication?
And it does fill a void in a province like New Brunswick that feels totally overlooked sometimes by the major media outlets. To me, I feel it's strange when you're at something and there aren't people there. The province is often just sort of overlooked for maybe Halifax in the Atlantic News, or maybe it's a news show that's done out of Toronto and broadcast here as local news.
Well, two things. We used to have the autonomy here in New Brunswick where the reporters, like if you worked at ATV or CHSJ, they made the decision on what was going to be covered that day. Now those decisions are being made out of province in Halifax, Montreal, Toronto, Calgary, Vancouver. A big difference. A big difference.
Do you see, though, where it's going? I mean, if we're at a point where we're underfunding news that needs to be investigative, where do we go from here? If we have spread out,
there has to be a priority put on news, that it's not just entertainment, right? And I used to struggle because I wanted the stories from the legislature to be closer to the top, because those stories were impacting on people's lives, like policy changes that were being made that were going to affect how much money a family receives, whether or not there's going to be jobs, bread on the table. But sometimes it would depend on if there was more emotion, a bad accident, someone crying, blood, that got closer to the top, you know. And I sure covered my share of disasters in my career, and it wasn't easy. And I think of one in Edmonton, you know, when it was the first time this had ever happened, and this woman killed her 4 children. And I had to interview her husband when he came home, and he was just finding out. And I asked him like 4 questions, but the last question I asked him, I said, "Do you still love your wife?" And you know what he said? Yes. You know, it's those kind of stories that people feel. And so you do the hard news, but also that's difficult news. And all news is important, and yes, the stations have to fund news. It has to be important. But the trouble is, you know, there's so much competition from the other channels, right? And people may not even know what station they're watching.
No. And now with the internet, I know when the Fredericton shooting happened, I Googled it, and what's the first thing that pops up is CNN, because Google's an American company, so they prioritize the American news, and it's a bigger outlet too. So
it was hard to believe that that could happen in Fredericton. Very, very, and in the situation in Moncton too. And that's why when I'm very privileged to work with New Brunswick EMO and teach their crisis communication, because it's so important that all the different cities and villages and towns in our province get this training, because you never know when it's going to come into play. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when. And you know, I can remember just before the RCMP members were murdered in Moncton, they had the director of communication at my course. And you know, she really didn't want to do interviews and all that. I said, "Isabel, you have to, you have to." So she did. And wasn't that good, because she was called on 24 hours a day after that, you know. And a wonderful person, very committed and talented.
What are some of the key things that you focus on when you're coaching someone to deal with a crisis?
Well, to be very clear and concise and accurate, because lives can depend upon it. And always check what other information is being said too, so that can be corrected. Have empathy and caring and sympathy for people. Don't come across as being arrogant, because that turns people off. Right? And public safety is the most important thing, and they want to be able to feel from your voice that you have things under control, that they can trust you, and that is the most important thing. And to always be honest. If bad news happens, you have to tell people about that, and you do it in such a way that's very honest. And I don't think reporters should ever become the news, all right? And that's another thing I teach in my course, you know, whether you're in government or whatever you're doing in corporate, because I also work with corporations too in communications. You know, always work and be honest, you know. Expense statements, don't fudge them. Don't do anything stupid that could bring you down, because it will bring you down.
And is there a checklist maybe you ask yourself, like, is this serving a purpose, kind of a thing, before you do something or cover something? Part of your ethics as a journalist that you bring to everything you do.
Yes, I bring ethics to everything I do, yes, because I believe in that. And I'll help in everybody, because it's not the money that drives me.
Yeah, not in journalism.
It's in my heart. It's in my heart, because I think so many people get into trouble when they fail to communicate properly. I've seen so many governments fall in this province because they didn't communicate properly, or they didn't have people in these positions that are so important who knew anything about communications. Oh, I'll put you in so-and-so, you know, somebody, right? And they didn't know anything about communications. And that's not good for the province. It's not good for a government.
Do you think our current political situation reflects that, where we have the People's Alliance and the Green Party becoming a presence for the first time, that people are weary of the old parties and perhaps their way or lack of way of covering or addressing things?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because sometimes parties come out of dissatisfaction, right? And if a party, a traditional party, is doing what people want and is responsive to those concerns, then you really don't need those other parties, right? Because the people's needs are being met by those politicians. It's only when these other parties show up that you see that's the evidence that maybe you're not doing as good a job as you could. And so I think it's very, very important. And I think when people run for election, it's important to be honest and say, this is my platform, right? And not say, no, I'm not going to talk about it or do this or, you know, wait and see. That's not fair to the people. And if people don't want to support you or vote for you, fine. But at least you've been honest and told them, this is what I believe in, this is what I intend to do. Right? And perhaps if Higgs had done more of that in the last election, he would have come out with a stronger majority. He's only got a 1-seat majority. And, you know, people are saying Glant was so bad. You wonder, well, why did he only win by 1 seat, right? So I think maybe you'll see Higgs open up and share more about what his platform is and everything like that, because I think that's important. I really do.
What would your advice to him be going forward, if you could give him a few pointers to win over more of the people, since he doesn't have the confidence of...
Well, he's got to be very careful. He can't run his government like he has a majority, right? He's got to be very careful. So good communication is critical. And I think if he does that, if he goes on shows like yours and is talking to people, you know, New Brunswickers, this is what we're facing, because there's some controversial issues, and the media thrives on controversy, okay? That's how come there's news. Unfortunately, we don't focus a lot on good news stories, all right? So we hear about the negatives, we hear about fracking, but that's a positive story, right? We've never had any problems as a result of fracking. And you know, the previous Alward government brought in some of the most stringent regulations covering fracking. More stringent than Alberta has, and they do a lot of fracking, and in the States, but that's not talked about. So it depends on who you have running your industry, and you have to have a trust with industry. And the industry is not going to put up money and take risk if it doesn't feel that it can depend on government too, because having that moratorium placed on industry really hurt the industry, it hurt the Sussex region, and it hurt our reputation as a province of being a good place to do business, because here we have so many people going out to Alberta, working in the same industry, and then not being able to do that at home. And that industry, when it was thriving here, it was bringing New Brunswickers home and paying them Alberta wages here. So I mean, that was a very positive thing. So I think on issues like that, whatever the issue is, really good communication. And not be afraid to lead. Not be afraid to lead, because we need leadership. And I think his background in Irving is a real positive, because Irving just doesn't have people there that don't know what they're doing. You have to be pretty good, right? So I see that as a positive, not a negative. And people like to sometimes, certain people like to knock Irving, but you know, when you think of how many people in our province work for Irving and a myriad of different companies, right? And how many families are being supported? I mean, I think that's pretty significant. So you don't bite the hand that feeds you necessarily.
Well, then on the flip side, what would your advice be to reporters in New Brunswick? If we are perhaps skeptical of the Irvings, what is the reporter's job, and what would you recommend New Brunswick reporters do going forward? To what stories should they be following?
I think whatever should be covered should be covered. I don't think reporters in New Brunswick shy away from covering anything. I just think that we don't have enough reporters. But we have some good reporters that stand out, and there are two that I think really deserve mention in New Brunswick. And in newspaper, that would be Tammy Scott Wallace. And on television, I would say it's Rachel Cave with CBC. Those two people work hard, they're trustworthy, they're dependable, and they cover the issues. And you know, they have to talk to people, right? And that's how you get your news.
Well, we owe a lot of that to people like you who pioneered the way for the rest of us to be doing stuff like we are today. Thank you so much for joining us, Margaret. It was a pleasure.
It was a pleasure, and thank you so much. And I love watching you, Vicki.
Thank you.
We need more independent television.
We're always taking volunteers.
That's good.
Southwest Magazine is a news and public affairs production of CHCO-TV, New Brunswick's only source for independent community television.